You're watching Covenant Eyes TV, helping you to stay safe and pure online. What do we do when our young children are exposed to pornography on the internet? To help us answer that question today, we have Jennie Bishop. Jennie is the best-selling author of the children's picture book, The Princess and the Kiss, a book born out of a need she felt to teach her own children about sexual purity and godly marriage, even from kindergarten age. She now speaks to parents all over through her Planned Purity seminars. She's also the author of Planned Purity for Parents, a book about creating a healthy environment for children to learn about purity, starting with the heart. All right, well, Jennie, you wrote this book here called Planned Purity for Parents. It's a fantastic book, but I want you to tell our listeners right now, why did you write it? What's it about?
I had a kindergartner come home one day, Luke, and tell me that she needed a boyfriend. And I was really stunned by that. I was doing everything possible I could with my little girls to just make sure that they knew what they needed to know and they were doing well in the way they felt about their body and what they were learning about themselves. But kindergarten, that was just out of the ballpark. And after that, I spent some time praying about that. And that's when I wrote a children's book called The Princess and the Kiss, which became an international bestseller. I had no idea where that book would head. And it was about a princess saving her kiss for a prince. Well, the follow-up to that was so many parents coming to me and saying, I want to teach purity, but I don't know how, because I wasn't pure myself. I didn't do these things myself. And so I started to formulate some ways of teaching just a basic structure for purity training throughout life, not just talking about purity in terms of what teens are doing, but how purity is formed over a lifetime. And that's where Planned Purity came from.
All right, so even just starting even when they're very young, talking about planning
Absolutely.
purity, right? And
Yeah.
This is interesting because I love the title of your book. You have this idea of planned purity for parents, but we know that a lot of parents, especially ones who might be listening right now, who maybe they've had conversations with their child about the birds and the bees, or about anatomy, or about whatever. Maybe they're trying to lay some groundwork, but what they don't expect is that the world is going to just ambush their children. Similar to the way that the world ambushed your children, but we are seeing this now online, where kids who are very young are stumbling onto graphic sexual content on the internet, and it's just an overload to the system. And all of a sudden, their parents are caught in the middle of, well, I don't know what to do now. I maybe wanted to plan how I talk to them about these things, but now I'm having to play catch up. Now I have this massive amount of sensory information that just hit my child, and they don't know how to interpret it, understand it, process it, or even how to feel about it. What in the world do I do? So if you were talking to a parent right now and they said their elementary age child had stumbled on pornography on the internet, how would you advise them to take whatever steps were needed? What steps should they take immediately right now?
Well, I would say begin planning.
Yeah.
Even if you haven't planned from the time they were very young, the time to start is now, no matter where you're starting with a child or where you're starting as a family, is to begin to consider how can we fill in some of those gaps and begin to make progress over a lifetime. This isn't a one big talk thing. Everything has to happen in tandem with each other in the context of relationship and conversation.
Sure.
So especially for a parent who is just coming up against that whole issue of pornography, the first important thing to know is exactly what kind of relationship they're having with the child. How did they respond to the first time they viewed pornography? Did they catch them and then overreact and maybe make that child feel ashamed of what they saw? Were they able to kind of step back and take some time to say, let's talk about what you saw here and what that means? I know our first tendency is to overreact because it's a very emotional issue.
Sure.
And I think the first thing you have to do is be in a place with that child where you can start to approach, gosh, maybe I overreacted a little bit, but let's talk about why this issue is so important. I have some things I want to tell you about this. And then begin to talk with the child about why it's so important to guard the eyes, because that's really what it comes down to, is the heart issues and all the input that comes from our senses and starts to make us and speak into the person that we're becoming.
So, in other words, the parent needs to frame for the child why this is a significant issue. So they shouldn't hide why this is important. They should just say, no, don't look at that, that's naughty stuff, or try to sweep it under the rug. They should actually try to help the child understand why this isn't
Oh,
appropriate.
right.
Okay. Well, what?
Right, because the child's probably just curious.
Right.
You know, depending on how much conversation they've had with the parent up to this point in issues of sexuality, especially if they don't know anything, they're probably looking for answers because they've probably been exposed more than the parent would suspect.
Right. I love what you say here in your book. You have this, in actually page 72 of your book here. You're going through and you talk about this idea of the gateways to our child's heart, which is a really interesting concept. You talk about the guarding, specifically the gate of the eyes. So you talk about things like what they're going to do on TV or going to see on the internet or movies or video games or reading material. And then you give these great tips for parents who are trying to be more proactive in these areas. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what can parents do from this point forward? Right? I mean, they've already been exposed to this material. Chances are the parent doesn't want it to happen again. So now let's talk about this sort of a proactive approach. What are some of the tangible, very practical things that a parent can do from this point forward that helps to guard the gate of the eyes?
Right. The first thing is to set a good example because the child is looking to you to have the right example
Right.
in what you're watching or how much time you're spending online or where you're viewing your computer. Practically, of course, you want to have the computer in a place where it can be viewed along with the child. If you put that computer in their room with them by themselves, they'll go anywhere. And that's just the curiosity of a child. They're exploring all the time.
Right.
So you want to consider where the computer is. You want to consider filters. You know, what you can use is filters. There's also things you need to know about passwords and how much the child is able to get into. So many parents are not internet savvy.
Right.
And so they're just learning some things that the child has maybe already discovered, even at a very young age, maybe from using the computers at school or
Sure.
a friend teaching them. So beginning to educate yourself, knowing exactly what the technology is that your child's dealing with and what kind of standards you want to set there has to be the start in looking at how to plan for what's coming in the future. So you can keep having the conversation with your child about where to draw those lines.
Right. And so then let's talk about the conversation itself. Let's talk about that first conversation, maybe the second conversation or whatever, after the overreaction or whatever. Let's say you have the first conversation with the child about what they saw. Let's say you have seen what they've seen. You know, you've investigated the situation. You know exactly what web pages they went to and the type of material they accessed, and now you're trying to help that child understand what it is they saw. And let's say they saw some fairly graphic sexual content, and now they're faced with, you know, all these questions or all these curiosities about what's going on or what did I see or whatever. Help the parent understand. Now, give them a kind of like what you do in your book here. You give them a script. That's what I love, right? One of the things that's great about this book is the scripts in the back. It's worth the price of the book alone. Even just the scripts in the back. It's wonderful stuff where you just kind of give parents exactly what to say. And that's what a lot of books on purity and sexuality, they're very heavy on principle, light on practicality. So you have this is a nice balance of both, where you have a lot of principle, but also heavy in practicality too. So give our parents now a sort of a script. What do they need to say? What is the kind of the words, the language they need to use to help to frame what the child has seen?
Right. Well, I think the first thing is to ask the child a question and let them answer.
Okay.
To say, what were you looking for? And how did you find what you found online? I'd like to know if you were curious or if someone told you about it. Get the child's input and really listen, because I think sometimes we're very quick to start telling them everything we think they need to know, but we don't even know where the child started, how this all started with them.
Sure.
Start the conversation with letting them voice that. And even prior to that, if you have overreacted, it is so key to just ask the child's forgiveness and to say, gosh, I really overreacted. I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to make you feel ashamed. I think maybe you were just curious. So that the child is open enough to not feel like, oh my gosh, I did something bad. And Mom, I don't even want to tell her what I'm thinking because she might really overreact again. I mean, setting the stage for that conversation is really important.
Right.
And then once you know that you're engaged in a place where the child really can share and you've been able to find out exactly why they started, be able to say, honey, there's some really important things that I want to share with you about this. And it's so natural for you to be curious because the human body is so interesting. And the things that happen between a man and a woman, I know they must be interesting to you. I mean, if there's a man and woman involved. or some of these things that you saw that the body can do, I'm sure you never saw before, and you just thought, wow, what is that? Or how did that make you feel?
Mm.
And get to the heart of where the child is feeling about that, because they probably felt some kind of shame or some kind of, just connection there with trying to figure out what they were viewing and if it was good or bad. Then from there, be able to say, honey, I need to tell you something about the beauty of the human body. You can ask me anything about it anytime, and I want to be able to be there for you and always answer your questions. There is such a neat beauty about it, and that beauty is a private thing too. When it comes to our nakedness and being clothed or unclothed, I want you to be able to recognize that that's a private thing that you're going to enjoy someday, probably with the person you're married to. And I want you to keep that as a gift for them. Some people are going to post that on the internet and put it online so everybody can look at it, but that kind of spoils the beauty of the gift. And I don't want that to be spoiled for you. And maybe start the conversation from there. Now, when I give any kind of a script, I always say, that's a start. That's just some ways for you to jump off and think that connects with me or something else would connect here.
Sure.
But those are just some ideas.
Yeah. Well, you actually do offer in this book a number of scripts. So in the instance, and you actually have a whole section on if your child's looked at pornography, your daughter
Right.
or your son has looked at pornography. Here are a variety of scripts or a variety of approaches to that. So I do encourage our listeners to
Right.
get the book and check out some of those scripts, because some of those are really interesting. And what's nice about that is that parents don't feel like they have to reinvent the wheel on.
Yeah.
This is something that modern parents anyway are having to deal with, unfortunately, all the time. They're having to deal with these kind of issues of pornography on the internet and those kind of things all the time. It's happening every day. And so it's nice that when parents can have conversations about these things and say, this is what I told my child, and this is what I'm telling my daughter, this is what I'm telling my son. So that's good to
Right.
learn from those who've been there. I think that's really important. Now,
And then to be able to back up a little bit and just go, okay, maybe we missed some of the planning that could have happened here, to be able to really know the technology and really set up the boundaries and standards that we wanted for our family.
right.
And to just come back and set some of those up and start doing that in the context of grace. It's not all about doing everything perfectly.
Right.
It's about discovering along the way, oh, there's some bricks missing in this house that we're trying to build that we want to be strong. Let's go back and see what we missed and put some things in place. That's all allowable.
Mhm.
I think people feel like once they've made a mistake, there's no way to go back and do anything different. There's grace for everything that happens, and that's how we keep moving forward and learning.
Right, right. And that moving forward is really kind of the next thing I want to talk to you about. You have this in your book here. You have this diagram here, this house diagram, where you're going
Yeah.
through, and I'll definitely show this to our viewers. You have this whole diagram here about how do you lay this foundation here? How do you begin to kind of prepare and build this this structure of purity in the heart of your child? What does that look like? What are all the angles and avenues for that? Now, for the parent who's just found that their child is looking at pornography, they're in triage mode. They're not necessarily thinking about tomorrow or the next day or 5 years from now or when their child gets married when they're an adult or whatever. They're not thinking about that stuff. They're thinking about, what do I got to do right now? But as they're dealing with the immediate situation, the question comes up, now what do I do? Like, where do I go from here? How do I begin laying a foundation that helps to not only guard and protect my child against sort of the vile things that are in the world, but how do I prepare them to live in a world without filters? How do I prepare them to live in a world without guards, without all the protections that my home might offer? I want them to be prepared for that world and plan to be pure people in that world. What does that look like? So why don't you just briefly, if it's possible to be brief about that, what is this? What does this structure look like? How do you lay this foundation? What do you do?
Well, there's certain steps that everyone moves through in the process of understanding purity. And I try to give just a format so that you can look at the whole picture and say, where are we in that structure? And how do we start from where we are to put in some of the pieces that we might have missed? It all starts with the ground, and the ground is engagement. You have to engage with the child and build the relationship with them so they feel safe talking to you. And then the foundation of the house itself is about what purity is. We tend to define it as something only sexual that has to do with teenagers. And purity is about our hearts.
Yeah.
It always starts with what kind of person we are.
And it's much more
And it
than
has
sex.
to do Right,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's about everything and it's about every age. It applies to everyone at every age. So we want to get that definition right. That's the foundation for everything there. And then we move to building the first floor, which is about how we manage the heart, how we learn to guard the heart. And this is all taken from Proverbs 4, where it talks about the heart being the foundation for everything, the wellspring of life. And our five senses are the input that we receive that builds up our heart or tears it down. So even the youngest child can understand how to guard their eyes, how to guard their ears, how to decide what they believe about the breath and keeping the breath sacred, what they say, and what they touch. Each one of those things is one of the doors of the heart that
Mm,
we build on the first floor with anybody's understanding of purity first.
right.
Then from there, we move on to the second floor, which is about the body and setting boundaries for the body. Once you have the heart in order, then you can start talking about, well, how's that going to affect how I act, what I do, the standards I want to set for my children. And the roof then is about accountability. You build a house, you don't put a roof on it, the rain comes, it all washes away, and all your work is gone. Well, hanging out with people who have the same belief systems, being accountable to people, your child being accountable to you, the church and the school situations where your child is, and getting them to be protected in those situations all build that roof of safety over the house. But then to me, the greatest aspect of the house is the yard of grace, that kind of white picket fence around it that says you can always start over. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have to ask forgiveness. You're going to have a sense of humor. And then you can do this thing. It's not about perfection. You burn the toast, you put a new slice of toast in, and you start again.
Right.
And that's, I think, how a lot of parents feel, is that, they've done something wrong and they can't do anything else about it. And we're all like that. There isn't one of us who are going to do this perfectly.
Mm.
That kind of pressure is too great to withstand. So I hope the house gives some sense of, this is where we might be in this process. These are some of the ways that we can strengthen, restart, add to, make it even stronger.
All right. And I do encourage our viewers to go check the book out, because it'll give not only practical ideas about what all those bricks in the house look like, but even then scripts and some practical scenarios and situations and information, and even kind of walk parent through question and answer style exactly what needs to happen. So I thank you for writing this book. I think it's wonderful, and I would just encourage any of the parents who are listening right now, go ahead, pick this book up and check it out. It's called Planned Purity for Parents. Do you have any final word that you want to give to any of the parents who are listening right now who are in that mode of panic where they just don't know what to do? Any final word of encouragement to them?
I would just assure them that it's not too late, Luke.
Yeah.
I think all of us have times where we feel like we've failed miserably as parents, or something's gotten into the house that's spoiled everything. And what I've learned over and over is those times when I was at my bottom, as far as a parent, I've found the richest, most productive teachable moments.
Mm.
It's always when something's failed, when something's fallen through, when something seems to have gotten through the cracks. It always makes for conversation that's so deep and so good. And I think if we can look at our mistakes
Right.
and the things that happen that we think are bad as opportunities to teach and learn and grow, we're never going to fail. All our failures are going to be turned around and used for good. That's the great part of continuing to pursue purity.